Hi, everyone, and thank you to Daryl for that brilliant talk. My name is Megan Walsh, and my talk is entitled Sexuality, Romance, and Gender when you have cerebral palsy and complex communication needs. So I've been a speech pathologist for over 15 years, specializing in working with people who use AAC and working with people with cerebral palsy sort of across the lifespan. And before becoming a speech pathologist, I was a disability support worker. I'm currently doing in my first year of my PhD with Deakin University, and I'm part of the CP Achieve CRE, including being financially supported by CP Achieve. And the CP Achieve is funded by the National Health and Medical Research Council. So my plan for this webinar is that hopefully it'll be helpful for any young person with CP, regardless of if you have communication difficulties or not. I'm going to tell you a little bit about my research, about what we know from advocates and from the research about the topic of sexuality, what you can do if you're a young person with CP, and what people around you can do. So my research is about conversations about sexuality with young people with CP and CCN. CCN means complex communication needs, and someone has CCN if they cannot meet their everyday communication needs with speech. So if you have CCN, you might use alternative and augmentative communication, another acronym called AAC, and that can be things like keyword sign, communication boards, communication devices, letter boards, facial expressions, your eye gaze, things like that. In terms of how many people with CP have CCN, according to the Australian CP Register, about 24% of kids with CP aren't able to use speech functionally. So that's about 24% that have CCN. An additional 38% of kids with CP have communication difficulties. So all up, that's about 62%. So more than half of the kids in Australia with CP have some kind of communication difficulty, which is why I hope that this talk is helpful to people, anybody with CP. The middle 3 dot points on here are my research questions. So what's happening now in conversations about sexuality with young people with CP and CCN? What do you, the young people, want to happen with those conversations? And what do your parents want to happen? And I'll tell you a little bit about how I'm doing the research. So I'm doing a literature search that I will tell you a little bit more about in a minute. But the main component of my research is that it's participatory, meaning that you, young people with CP and CCN, are the experts. And I'm learning from you about to get the answers to those 3 questions. So what do we know from the research and what people with lived experience of disability are telling us? So my literature search, there's not a lot out there to tell us about adolescents with CP and CCN and sexuality. So Daryl did a very, very thorough systematic review of the literature for people with congenital disabilities and complex communication needs. And still there was not a lot of research. So I had to open it up a little bit. So my literature search looks at young people with CP and conversations about sexuality, young people with CCN and conversations about sexuality, and then what sort of themes and issues and methods and things overlap, and what can we learn from that overlap? And then what do we need to fill in with the literature about people with disabilities more broadly? So when I'm going through these slides, I'll tell you what people with lived experience, disability advocates, are telling us, and I'll tell you about what the research that we do have is telling us. So these are things you might be thinking if you're a young person with CP and or complex communication needs. You might be thinking about sexuality. So I love this tweet. Disabled people have sex. That's the tweet. And it shouldn't be that shocking, but we've just learned from Daryl's talk that it is. So we know that young people with CP and or complex communication needs are thinking about sexuality, but that a whole lot of us who don't have disabilities, a whole lot of us around you don't think about you thinking about sexuality. So the entire reference list at the end of these slides basically says, young people with CP are thinking about sexuality. You might also be thinking about gender identity. So I really love this tweet. Tuttle Turtle is an AAC user, and they're non-speaking. And they said, there is no disability that keeps you from knowing who you are. There's nobody who is too disabled to know their gender. Hashtag we are not confused. And I thought that was really powerful and quite confronting, actually, because I think sometimes I've been guilty of thinking that someone has too profound of an intellectual disability or communication difficulties to know about their gender identity. And I'm wrong. This other tweet from Andrew Gurza. So Andrew has cerebral palsy. I use they pronouns to actively reject the idea that I have to conform to any standard. It also allows for my disability to be included in my identity in a way that feels more authentic. I am Andrew Gurza. I am disabled. I use he, they pronouns. Now you know. So people with CP, people with complex communication needs are thinking about their gender identity. From the research, we know that women with disabilities, including cisgender women, are thinking about how they perform gender, how girly they are, how to use that femininity or lack thereof to attract people. Men with CP are struggling with masculinity and if they can embody and demonstrate masculinity when their body isn't typically masculine. And people with disabilities who are genderqueer or transgender find themselves masking as cisgender, so pretending that they're not transgender or genderqueer when they're engaging with disability services, because those disability services are assuming that they're cisgender. You might also be trying to figure out self-esteem and body image. So this one tweet, disabled people, you're worthy of physical affection if and when you want it. Your body is wonderful as is. So sort of countering that idea that if you're disabled, your body isn't as beautiful. This one from the spastic diplegia. Newsflash, disabled people are sexy too. If you overlook that, you're missing out. Love to disability Twitter. You all look good and are worthy. So a lot of people with disabilities are trying to negotiate, whether they're attractive, whether they are able to be a good partner romantically and sexually, what this means for their identity, that disability and sexuality and identity coming together, especially for young people trying to figure this out. So the author of Crip Theory, McRuer, talks about heteronormativity and able-bodiedness as the norm, and everybody else is deviant from the norm, almost opposite from the norm. And that's where a lot of people with disabilities find themselves, is opposite of the norm. And these are themes that are across the literature. So you can find these themes in almost every article that's listed in my reference list. You might need or want more sex education. So again, across the literature, we've found out that people with CP want more information about sexuality and CP, including sexual function. People with disabilities want more information and education about positive sexuality. So there's a very strong focus on preventing abuse and keeping people with disabilities safe, and not as much information on how to engage in positive sexuality. They want more sex education in general. They don't feel like they're getting enough, especially in specialist schools. And again, these are themes across the literature, so you'll find these in most of the references at the end. And finally, in terms of things you might be thinking about, you might want to know that there are other people out there like you, whether that's knowing people and having mentors who have gone through this, or seeing yourself represented in the media. So this tweet references the Netflix show Sex Education. And in it, there's a character named Isaac who has quadriplegia. And there's a pretty powerful sex scene. And Disability Twitter had a lot to say about it. So this Twitter user, who uses the pronoun she, they, said, the sex scenes in Sex Education with Maeve and Isaac are literally making me cry because it's just so nice to be represented for once. So there's a real craving for media representation. And Shuttleworth, in his work with men with CP, just noted a lack of sexual negotiation models for disabled people. So in simple language, people with disabilities don't get to see what sexual and romantic relationships can look like for them. So then to switch from things you might be thinking if you're a young person with CP and or complex communication needs to things your parents are thinking. Parents are worried and parents want to do the right thing. So there's a bit of research that says parents are trying to find the balance between keeping their kids safe and supporting those social, romantic, sexual relationships, supporting that independence that young people are going through and establishing. We also know that parents of people with CP and parents of people with complex communication needs play a role in their ability to express their sexuality. So Daryl found in his literature review and his thesis, the parents can be barriers or facilitators to engaging in sexual and romantic relationships. And then Shuttleworth noted that parents can portray negative attitudes. So sometimes parents can portray that ableism and that infantilization, and parents can have that assumption that you don't have a sexuality if you have significant disabilities. So parents are trying to figure this out. They're thinking about it. And that's part of the research, is to figure out what parents need. So what can you do as a young person with CP about sexuality and gender identity? Well, you can find someone you can communicate with about these things. So find someone that you trust, that you can ask these questions to. You know, what's it like to have sex when you have CP? A really common question, how do I find a boyfriend? How do I find a girlfriend? Or what are they talking about on the TV, that thing I just saw? So find somebody you trust who can answer those questions for you. Find a mentor. So find somebody who has navigated this. You know, Daryl mentioned online dating. So find somebody with CP or physical disability, or find somebody with complex communication needs who's navigated online dating and romantic relationships and can kind of give you some tips and just let you know that you're not the only one out there. Find your people online. You know, we obviously have to be careful with social media and online, but it's also making it easier to find other people who are going through what you're going through across the globe. And this is a bit of shameless self-promotion. Get involved in research or advocacy. So basically tell the researchers what you need so that we can get that message out there about what you need. What can you do to help if you are a person around young people with CP or young people with complex communication needs? I guess the first thing, and it seems simple, but it's not always easy, is just know that young people with CP are thinking and wondering about these topics. Know that it's on their minds. Be inclusive in your practice. So what I mean by that is leave options open, you know, whether you are planning activities, you know, leave footy interests and going to the cafe and spa days open to anyone of any gender. Keep your talk about romantic interests open. So we often, you know, when we're talking to a young woman with communication difficulties, we might talk about whether she thinks any of the male footy players are cute. So just keep that open. Is there anybody you think is cute? facilitate conversations about these topics. And that obviously depends on your role. But if you're a therapist like me, you can work with parents and support workers to open up those conversations appropriately, and to kind of advocate for these things to happen. And if you're a parent, you could start having these conversations little by little. Learn more about sexual and reproductive health and CP, because people with CP want to know. This is particularly for parents, but find a mentor for you. I know that this is an absolutely terrifying topic for you, and that's okay. And there are parents that have gone before you and navigated this terrifying time. So talk to them and figure out what they did. And then, again, some shameless self-promotion. Get involved in research and advocacy. So tell us what you're worried about, what we can do to help, what we can do to support your young people. So if you want to know any more, you can email cphchief@mcri.edu.au, and you can ask about any of the information from today in more detail, future podcasts, presenting, webinars, the newsletter, participating in research, or registering your interest to do things like that, or really anything else. You can also follow us on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook. And you can go to CP Achieve's website for more information. And here, I apologize for the really, really small text. You can email us if you would like this reference list. But here's the reference list from what I talked about today. Thank you, everybody, for your time and your interest. And I hope that some of you will get in touch. Thanks.